Very brief introduction to our presenters and our esteemed discussants. Umesh Moramudali, he currently serves as a lecturer in the Department of Economics at the University of Colombo. He has an MSc in Economics from the University of Warwick, where he was a Chevening Scholar. His research mostly focuses on public finance, middle-income transition, and the political economy of the middle class. He will be looking at this extremely important, in fact, the extremely important issue of regional inequality, in particular of regional inequality in the labor market, because he notes quite rightly that on the one hand there is labor migration to just a couple of provinces on the west, and on the other hand there's sort of deepening stagnation in terms of economic opportunities in the rest of the country, and he looks at certain structural features. His paper will be discussed by Dr. Thiruni Kelegama, who is a departmental lecturer with the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies. The research focuses on how development projects in Sri Lanka reshape power, space, and identity. And the paper that Umesh presents is precisely the confluence of the three. Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar, senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology at the University of Jaffna. He holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of New York. He's deeply interested in agrarian issues and cooperatives. And most of you would have read his extremely widely followed writings on the political economy of Sri Lanka. We'll turn to Umesh. Let's come back because there's a bit of a technical hitch. Umesh's paper looks specifically at labor migration and the causes of labor migration, where there are employment opportunities arising on a differential basis across the regions. He just looks at a 0-1, where he's looking at Colombo and the western provinces when compared to the rest of the country. And there he looks at both at conditions of work, at wages. As with all the other researchers, we found, and this is just a brief introduction, that there is a paucity of large-scale surveys and publicly available data based on surveys. And as we all recognize, in fact, as our researchers would bring forward, limitations in data are something that needs to be addressed through public investment. That's very crucial because in the absence of that data, it'd be extremely difficult to challenge economic orthodoxy. So we will just have government after government belonging to various political dispensations following a roughly similar path. I'm deeply aware that on the one hand, most of the angst in the recent past has been against sort of cronyism or arbitrary decision making. But deeper than that, and maybe populism, but deeper than that, there has not been much of a critique. And what we're really hoping is with additional investment in public data, we would be able to arrive at deeper analysis. I think we have Umesh here. Kausalya, should we turn it over to him?
First of all, thank you very much for NTT to provide this opportunity, and Srini and Srini and two other reviewers for reviewing my paper. This was very useful and truly one of the needs at the time, I felt. So I would like to acknowledge all of their contributions and support to this paper. So let me delve into my presentation. Okay, so my topic is Sri Lanka's spatially skewed growth through middle income transition. What I'm trying to do here is to go into a deep dive of this. So let me, before I go into extensive details of my research, let me present the rationale for which and the context in which this research becomes significant. So as most of you may know, Sri Lanka is currently a middle income country, and Sri Lanka became a middle income country in 1997. Before that, Sri Lanka was a low income country. This is largely due to, not largely, actually entirely due to the increase of countries per capita, because you measure countries' income levels based on the per capita. So in 1997, Sri Lanka became a middle-income country. Middle-income countries has two segments. One is the lower middle-income country. The other is the upper middle-income country. So the sequence is that your sequence is that you are a low-income country, then you become a low middle-income country, upper middle-income country, then high-income country. That is the sequence. So Sri Lanka became a lower middle-income country in 1997. And then even after 1997, Sri Lanka's per capita income grew rapidly. And as a result of that, Sri Lanka passed the next threshold by becoming the upper middle income country in 2018. But this didn't really last per se. And as a result of that, Sri Lanka's per capita income dropped again in 2019. So Sri Lanka, soon after upgrading to upper middle income country, again downgraded into a lower middle income country, right? So, but Sri Lanka is at the very high end of the lower middle income countries, sort of almost reaching the upper middle income bracket. So the point here is that between 1990 and 2018, Sri Lanka's GDP per capita almost tripled. It means Sri Lanka's average income of a person significantly increased. Country's GDP significantly increased. As you could see, more buildings come up in Colombo, and then in some areas you also see more roads being developed. You see this sort of development that is taking place. But on the other hand, there were a couple of major issues through this transition. So Sri Lanka, there was a middle income transition for Sri Lanka. But during the period that Sri Lanka actually transitioned into a middle income country, Sri Lanka's tax performance deteriorated. Sri Lanka's tax revenue significantly came down. Sri Lanka's export performance deteriorated. Sri Lanka's debt dynamics got worse. All of those structural weaknesses led to sovereign default in 2022. That means Sri Lanka stopped repaying debt in 2022. As you all know, we went through the worst economic crisis in country's post-independent history during 2022 and 2024. So the point is, when Sri Lanka upgraded to upper middle income country, there was a middle income transition, Sri Lanka's fiscal situation, balance of payment situation, export situation deteriorated. That is a topic that is vastly talked about. That is not what I'm going to talk about today. What I'm going to talk about today is the spatial growth. Right? So I have given this graph, so it is convenient for you to see. You can see that in 1990, we were a low-income country. This is our per capita, 472. In 1997, we became a lower middle-income country. Per capita was 813. You can see it's almost doubled. And then you can see this has significantly increased between 1997 and 2018. We became an upper middle-income country. Then you see this slight drop in 2019. With that slight drop, again we become a lower middle income country. But you see that compared to 1990, Sri Lanka's per capita in 2019 is a significant increase, right? But with although this increase was there, you can see that most of this increase is coming from the Western province. That is what I wanted to focus, because there's enough written about the tax performance and how it has gotten worse. But what I want to talk about is when Sri Lanka continued to develop, from where that development came from. You can clearly see that in 2018, almost 40% of country's gross domestic product, GDP, came from the Western province. Then the question is, has that always been the case? So to present this case, this is a well-known fact that most of country's production is located in the Western province. But the point is, has that always been the case? So this graph, putting together through multiple sources of data, you can clearly see that this is, you can see in the very first bar graph, evolution of Western province. You can still see that Western province has been historically accounting for nearly 40% of the GDP. You can see that there's a slight decline of that in 2018, but that's not a significant decline. And you can see for the other provinces, this remains pretty much the same. You don't see a significant increase of production composition of other countries. What this means is that most of the country's production, most of the country's businesses, services, industries are concentrated in the Western province. And the first point I want to present today is that this has remained pretty much unchanged across Sri Lanka's middle income transition, right? Because this is not something that you often put together. What I wanted to do is firstly to put together and show that Sri Lanka's growth continued to be spatially skewed. It is continued to be centered around Western province across countries' middle income transition. That means those who migrate to the Western province has more opportunities, so on and so forth, right? And then you can see on this particular graph, I'm sorry I'm putting too many graphs, but this is very easy to convey this dynamic. You can clearly see the differences of per capita for each province. This, in simple terms, means what is the average income of a person in a particular province, right? So let's say you randomly pick a person in Western province, what would be that person's average income? Doesn't mean that that person always have a specific income. It's the average income divided by total income of the province divided by the total population of the province. So it just gives an average. Right? There might be outliers. But what you can see here is that GDP per capita, average income of a person in Western province is significantly higher than other provinces. You can very clearly see that through the orange bar chart, and you can see that 1990, 2004, 2009, 14, and 19. In fact, you can clearly see that this gap is slightly increasing, right? And then in this particular line shows you the GDP per capita of the country. I can show you major two things from here. One is that you can see that the Western provinces per capita, that means Western provinces average income of a person is higher than the average income of the country. You can see that the average income of the country is around 4,000 when we were upgraded to upper middle income country. You can see that in the Western province, average income of a person is significantly higher, right? It's more than 5,000. On the other hand, you can see that average income of people in other provinces, what I call the peripheral provinces, their average income is lower than country's average income of a person. So what you're essentially seeing is that if you are in the Western province, your income tends to be a lot more. You can earn more, you have more opportunities, so on and so forth, right? I hope this point is clear. Then what does this all shows is Sri Lanka's middle income transition has been spatially skewed. It's like you have the growth, there was growth, but it was spatially skewed. It means like growth, you have the development in the country, you have sort of growth, but that is largely concentrated in the Western province, right? And I want to make it clear that Sri Lanka briefly became an upper middle income country in 2018, although this didn't last long, it just lasted 1 year, but I'm using this year as a benchmark from 1990 to 2018 because during that period, the transition did take place. It's a secondary concern that it didn't last. But what I want to highlight is through that transition from a low-income country to an upper mid-income country, growth was largely coming from the Western province, right? So in that context, what I'm trying to explore is what are the implications of this so-called spatially skewed growth, and why was Sri Lanka's growth continued to be spatially skewed from economic, political, and social reasons? What is so special about Western province? Why the growth is continued to be concentrated in the Western province, right? So one of the reasons is that labor demand dynamics. What do we mean by labor demand? It essentially means the amount of labor that employers seek to hire during a given time. In very simple terms, how many jobs are available? You can clearly see that, you can see that most jobs are concentrated in the Western province, right? Most job vacancies are available in the Western province, and the other provinces has limited vacancies. What does this mean is that if you are migrating to the Western province, or if you are coming to the Western province, you have a higher tendency to find a job, right? Because businesses are located in the Western province, and when the growth is continue to be concentrated in the Western province, people in other provinces will continue to migrate to the Western province or try to come to the Western province seeking a job. And that will further enhance the growth of the Western province, right? So the key is the labor demand. This is an issue that is barely highlighted when we talk about the issues in Sri Lanka, because people don't have jobs outside Western province. I'm not saying there's not entirely not available, but you can clearly see from the data. This is from the Department of Census and Statistics. They conducted the labor demand survey in 2018. You can see how limited jobs are available in other parts of the country compared to the Western province. So they do really struggle in terms of finding jobs outside. It's not easy, right? So other side is, okay, firstly, you don't have much jobs in the peripheral provinces. That forces you to look for jobs in the Western province. Other is the salary differentials, right? I'm trying to, sort of reemerge, sort of reuse the word Kolomata Kirigamata Kakiri to showcase the fact that in the peripheral provinces, in the provinces outside the Western, their salaries are lower than the salary in the Western province. You can clearly see that from the data. This is the database data on Labor Force Survey 2018. You can see that the monthly salary as well as the monthly wage of workers in Western province is significantly higher than in the other provinces. So not only you don't have much jobs outside Western province, even the jobs that you have outside Western province pay lower than the jobs in the Western province, right? In the Western province, you can see that the average salary is to 39,000, and you can see in Central province it is 30,000. You can see the average monthly wage in Colombo is 24,000, and in Central province it is 20,000. I like to make a distinction between this, what is the difference between salary and daily wage here. The daily wage here is the jobs that provide, calculate the payment based on for the number of works that they work, number of days that they work. In the case of salary, it's more like a formal employment. You have a fixed salary plus different allowance, right? So salary refers to more like the formal sector. Daily wage rather refer to the some part of the informal sector, and in the cases where salary is determined by number of days that they work. And what you can also see is that this may have led to, I'm not drawing a causal links here. I have to be very specific about that, because it's very difficult to bring causal links in a very short time frame in research. What I try to present here is a thesis, an intuitive idea, where how the spatially skewed growth had shaped Sri Lankan economy and the consequences of it. So one of the things that you can clearly see is that as Sri Lanka's per capita increasing, you can see that the labor force participation rate coming down. This is not the labor demand. Labor demand is businesses giving jobs. Labor supply is people deciding to work. You can see less and less people deciding to work. Maybe, but one of the propositions that I'm trying to put forward is that because there aren't many jobs, people, particularly outside the Western province, choose not to work, indicated by the lower, significantly deteriorating labor force participation rate. And you can see that the labor force participation rate across the provinces, and you can see that it is not significantly going up across years. You can see when we were upgrading into a middle income country, it remains in the pretty much same amount compared to what we are in 2018. In certain cases, labor force participation rate had deteriorated. So the point is that there was no labor demand. On the other side, people are also reluctant to participate in the labor force across provinces. And other thing is, so I mentioned about limited job opportunities outside and the limited pay. And even the job opportunities available outside the Western province, most of them are not in the highest paying occupations. Based on the labor force survey data, I have classified into 4 major occupation types. You can see managers and professionals get paid more, clerical staff get paid little less than that, and skilled workers and unskilled workers getting the lowest pay. And you can see that in most cases, what we see is in most of the peripheral provinces, you have the unskilled work, right? The opportunities available are for the unskilled work. So your chances to earn is less. And similarly, on the peripheral provinces, most of the job opportunities are available in the agricultural sector. And in agricultural sector, wages are significantly lower than the other sectors. You don't have much chances to earn in that sector compared to the other sectors. That you can see by this data. You can see agriculture and related industries has significantly lower salary or wages per month compared to other industries. For example, you can see in the manufacturing industry and in the trade related services or professional services, salaries are way higher, and although the salaries, so most of these industries are located in the Western province, and most of the jobs available in peripheral provinces are in the agriculture and related services. As you can see here. And what does it mean is, for a lot of people in the peripheral provinces, their chances of earning is very lower compared to the Western province. What has this led to? The consequences is, one is the labor force participation and stagnated. The most important point that I want to make is this has promoted the internal migration to the Western province. Because of the limited labor demand, because limited job opportunities and the low wages in the peripheral provinces, that has pushed many educated youth to migrate to the Western province. So think of an average person getting the education in Anuradhapura or Monaragala or in Trincomalee. The likelihood of that person coming to the Western province is more, and the factors continue to push them to come to the Western province because they cannot really earn much in these peripheral provinces. So what it does is it concentrates the skilled labor, it concentrates the educated labor into the Western province, right? On the other hand, migrating to Western province or traveling daily to Western province can be costly, and as a result of that, it is difficult to manage such dynamics for a mid-skilled youth, right? So what happens is some people prefer to get a government job in their province. For example, someone in Puttlam will likely to settle into a job located in Puttlam Divisional Secretariat or District Secretariat rather than coming to Colombo daily or residing in Colombo daily, because either residing in Colombo means they have to pay rent. Coming to Colombo daily means a lot of transportation costs. So even if they're getting paid a higher salary in Colombo, if they are in the mid-range of the work, their actual return is very less because they have to spend a lot of money for rent or traveling. And what this does is, you can see that nearly 60% of the vacancies in skill and professional services are located in the Western province. This continue to reinforce the migration flows. And it's like a vicious cycle on the other way, because you already have like businesses established in Colombo, and that push the skill employees or skill youth, skill people to come to the Western province. And because skill population is in the Western province with the highest earning capacity, they will spend more money. That will further expand the businesses in the Western province. And when the businesses are expanding in the Western province, they tend to focus again on hiring from the Western province, because that's where the most of the skilled youth are, right? So that sort of feeds into that. And that this also increased the urbanization, rising the housing prices and real estate in the Western province. And thus, in politically, Western province becomes an important voting bloc for the middle class, further converging to the Western province. In terms of the causes, I want to establish that there's a significant informal sector dominance in Sri Lanka. And why the informal sector dominance? You can clearly see that there's about 30% coming from informal entrepreneurs. What this means is usually a person who's doing a small boutique or something in that sort. And this, you can see, has continued to be the case, and playing an important part of the economy as well. I presented this before. So what are then the causes, again, for the spatially skewed growth? One is, as I've highlighted, wage differentials. Wage differentials continue to reinforce migration flows. Then there is urbanization effects. Nearly 30% of the Western province populations were migrants, because you could clearly see that converging is happening. And now more and more middle class prefer urban living in Western province over peripheral regions. This is not largely due to the infrastructural deficiencies, which I have discussed in the paper. Infrastructure in the peripheral provinces had actually gotten way better, but limited economic opportunities are available. But also socially, the tendency is to migrate to the Western province, because there is that social dynamic where the Western province is preferred particularly by the middle class. This is what you call a cumulative causation. Because Western province initially had the colonial rule and as an administrative trading hub at the initial part, and then you had the Colombo port and international airport. So this continue to add on things as a economic center, what you call a clustering. What's the political economy is, the successive governments prioritize Western province growth because this is easier. It is within an election cycle. If you want to derive more growth will come from the Western province. If you want to expand this growth to the peripheral provinces, it is rather difficult to do within one electoral cycle, because if you think that if you focus on the Western province, you will have a higher growth. But if you try to facilitate the growth outside Western province, that will take a little more time than the Western province. So that is something I believe successive governments considered as not beneficial for them. So how they reach the peripheral regions is targeted mainly through welfare, subsidies, and infrastructure. So the people in those areas were temporarily happy. Their votes were attracted through such, but very limited formal job creation in those areas. As a short-term strategy, this worked. But what happened is, even though you have the infrastructure in the peripheral regions, those did not really transform those into regional economic hubs or reduce the spatially skewed group. So what I'm recommending is, I must tell, is an ongoing research. This requires a further work and a lot of work. In fact, this is an area that has actually largely been focused in Sri Lanka. It's not researched very much. So integrated regional planning and macro national planning, when you plan the National Planning Department has some planning done, but I think the macro planning division was abolished some time ago. One proposal is to re-establish the macro planning division, and through re-establishing it, you can looking at how we can focus on a more less spatially skewed group. Then strengthen peripheral economies, particularly building like trade hubs, so that not everything has to come to Colombo, whereas the economic activities happen then and there. For example, further developing Dambulla or out that Anuradhapura region as a regional trade hub, and provide support to the micro and small medium enterprises. This is where I make this link to the largest chunk of informal sector, that is micro and small medium enterprises. So you have to empower them, and you have to link them to the regional trade hubs and also the global value chains to improve their earnings, and also focus on employment creation in the outside Western province, rather not just providing government jobs, but I think the three above recommendations would result in some sort of an employment creation and thereby equitable growth path. So that is what I have to say, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Umesh. May I now invite Dr. Thiruni Kelegama to present her observations.
Okay, there you go. Good morning. It's very early in the morning for me, so apologies for the darkness. But good morning, everyone, and thank you to the Neelan Thiruchelvam Trust for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to comment on Umesh's paper, and I'll start by saying why, because I do believe that the paper is incredibly bold, right? It takes one of the questions that is often swept under the rug, because we like to tell ourselves, I think, lots of success stories, how Sri Lanka became middle-income country, how per capita GDP tripled, how the country briefly reached middle-income status. But the paper really, and what Umesh has really done is, he's asked success for whom, and the crucial question of success where. When you dig beneath the averages, what you really see is that much of the celebrated growth, as he shows, was geographically narrow, socially exclusionary, and also incredibly structurally fragile. And that's the contribution of the paper, I think, because it moves beyond this very triumphalist story and looks at the much harder question of what middle income transition actually means. So there were three contributions that stood out to me in the paper. First, the data work is incredibly impressive. It's not a paper that makes any kind of big claim about inequality. Umesh has gone into provincial GDP, like labor force surveys, salary differentials, migration patterns, and pulled it all together into a very coherent account. And as he said, it's an ongoing piece of research, right? It's a research that's evolving. Second, I also think that the framing is innovative. Instead of treating regional inequality as a just unfair distribution of national wealth, the paper really reframes it as a labor market pathology, right? The concentration of labor in the Western province didn't just skew income, it's entrenched informality and depressed labor participation and also forced people to migrate. The fact that 60% of Sri Lankan employment remained informal even during the supposed high point of development is frankly, it's a big deal. And the third, the paper doesn't shy away from history as well and politics. It traces Colombo's dominance back to colonial infrastructure and shows how liberalization reinforced those advantages and highlights how the war really locked out whole regions of development. It makes clear that these disparities aren't just technical failures, but structural features of Sri Lanka's political economy. So I can also see how the paper has improved from the first version that I saw. The argument is clearer. The discussion of state interventions shows much clearly how electoral cycles and short-term politics limited their impact. But let me also push a couple of ways where I think the paper there is room for strengthening the paper as well. And let me give a few points here. The paper shows very strong correlations between spatial concentration, informality, and migration. But here, this is where I think the mechanisms aren't always very clearly spelled out. Is informality then in peripheral provinces about weak labor demand as a first question? Or does it then reflect weak regulation or institutional neglect, so to speak? And then if it's just about demand, then the solution would be, is it to move the industries outwards? But if it's also institutional, then the policy challenges become much more complex. The second is about typologies of interventions, right? We get a long list of programs such as garment factory dispersal, the Regional Economic Advancement Program, road building under Rajapaksa, but they're mostly discussed as failures. And some were infrastructure heavy, some were industrial dispersal attempts, and some were basically welfare in disguise. So in a way, what happens when you put them all together, it misses nuance maybe, and maybe that would be something to think about. The garment factory programs, while imperfect, does show what kind of success does it show? And what makes the difference between interventions that failed outright then and the things that at least shifted things temporarily? And that typology could be valuable beyond Sri Lanka, so to speak. Third, I would like to kind of push a little bit more on the theoretical framework that Umesh is using, right? The paper draws on concepts such as cumulative causation and also self-reinforcing growth. And these very clearly apply to Sri Lanka, but they're also sometimes applied a little bit in a way that it could be done in a much more rigorous way. When discussing why businesses, say, cluster in the Western province, we get an account of infrastructure advantage and market access. But this doesn't explain why then, even with improved roads, businesses still didn't disperse. So there is something a bit more complex going on than this economic geography framework maybe that it can't capture alone. Fourth, kind of getting to the policy specificity. The recommendations are good, right? And as we just saw on the screen before, you have policy recommendations such as strengthen micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, develop peripheral growth centers, also integrate local governments. But what it doesn't do really is grapple with the political economy constraints, really. What does creating quality employment actually look like, right? If REAP is revived, what safeguards could really stop electoral cycles from derailing it again? And how do you fund peripheral development when the state is essentially bankrupt is another question, right? And what are the guidelines that could strengthen this side of policy contribution? But let me step back as well, because the paper also is not really about Sri Lanka, but how to narrate middle income transitions more broadly. Sri Lanka's case shows really very simply, I think, that you can hit income thresholds without actual structural transformation. You can become middle income on the back of services, construction, say debt fuel consumption, while leaving the labor market largely informal and your regions very deeply unequal. And that's not sustainable, and that's when the shocks come in and that kind of model collapses. And Sri Lanka is not really an anomaly either, right? We've seen similar stories elsewhere where growth is geographically concentrated, the peripheries are left behind, and the politics of inequality eventually catches up. And this is where the connection could be made a little bit maybe more explicit between this spatial model and the inevitable crisis that happened in 2022. If you build development on geographic concentration or debt finance consumption and informal employment, then of course that's a fragile thing that you're looking at. But to conclude then, the paper is important because it tells this less uncomfortable story, I believe. It reminds us that Sri Lanka's brief upper middle income moment was not inclusive growth culminating, but really a snapshot of an exclusionary model that had already run out of steam, so to say. And the deeper problem was really then a spatially skewed, informality-driven growth path that left too many people and places outside the circle of opportunity, as Umesh very showed during this presentation itself. So on that note, I do want to congratulate Umesh on a very deeply relevant piece of work, and I look forward to the conversation that follows and the final version when it comes out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thiruni Kelegama. May I now invite Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar, please? His
Uh,
comments.
yes, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay. Thank you, Srini, and thank you, Umesh, for the presentation. Um, a very important topic. So I'm just going to make a few remarks here in terms of some perhaps questions to get all of us also thinking not only about Umesh's paper, but the kind of way in which Srini had framed this events as about the kind of structural constraints in terms of Sri Lanka's development and crisis. The first issue that I want to kind of bring up with Umesh's paper is, how much do we place importance on GDP growth, per capita GDP, for the reason that, Sri Lanka showed extremely high rates of GDP growth in 2010, 11, and 12. But I would argue that itself was part of the cause of the crisis. In other words, it was debt-driven growth. That's when we started borrowing heavily in the international capital markets, as well as getting loans from the multilateral institutions. This was during the post-war phase, which led to high levels of GDP growth. And regardless of just the Western province as well, I mean, if you look at that period, even in the North and the Eastern province, those years, there was very high provincial GDP growth. In the North and East, also because we were starting from a very low base, and also because that was where a lot of the post-war reconstruction was happening. But this growth was not sustainable, regardless of whether it was in the Western province or in the rest of the country, for the reason that it wasn't going to provide the returns. And this, I would say, has been a phenomena since liberalization. So rising inequality, absorption of external capital in real estate, in infrastructure, which can show high levels of growth from time to time. Of course, in the case of Sri Lanka, it was also disrupted by the war, but not lead to sustained growth, but only rising inequality, and it doesn't lead to the kind of employment that we would like to see. In that context, I think Umesh's recommendation about macro planning, which we also kind of abandoned along with the shift towards neoliberal policies, or what we called open economy policies, becomes important here. And there needs to be, I think, considerable rethinking in terms of, the question of planning, which, and not only planning, but also industrial policy, which, in many parts of the global south were abandoned with neoliberal policies. And now there is a revival of thinking on the need for some of these institutional forms. So planning, industrial policy, the need for development banks, which could actually intervene in the regions. Our two development banks, as you know, were both privatized and commercialized in the 1990s. Another sort of question for us to think about, and when we're thinking of incomes and employment, to have a household perspective, because most of our households and not only in the regions, but I would say all over the country, in a country like ours, depend on multiple income streams. So some of it might come from a formal sector, some of it might be in-kind earnings. They might have some farm incomes. So rural households have a complex calculation in terms of how they're managing their household incomes, and they're also considering the cost of living, as Umesh also mentioned about why there is also a disincentive at times towards migration to the Western province because of the higher expenses, whether it's rent income or higher cost of living. So to think about how they continue to manage their household incomes, I think we need a kind of a deeper understanding of the multiple sources or pluri-incomes that determined household incomes, and just thinking of growth in the formal sector itself may not be the full answer to this question. In this context, thinking ahead, and with Umesh's paper, which has established this gross inequalities in terms of the region versus the West, the kind of uneven development that we have, the question of investment, where and what kind of investment would be important. As I mentioned, there has been investment. If you look at post-war North, on which I worked just between 2009 and 2013, after the war, there was close to 2.53 billion US dollars in investment, but that has not created that kind of sustained growth. And so the form of investment is important, and that is where I think we continue to fail. Now, you might have seen in the media that there is a new World Bank program that's being developed for the next few years. But there again, much of the emphasis is on investment in tourism as opposed to tradables or even a production-related economy and growth. So this continued failure, not just on the part of our government, but also in terms of what is being pushed by the donor agencies, whether it's the World Bank or ADB, is also in a way part of this failure. And I would want Umesh to think a little bit more deeper about in comparing industries and how much our data actually correctly portrays the kind of incomes and returns from different sectors within the industrial sector, subsectors. So, because I would say that still the large scope for Sri Lanka using physical resources would be agricultural industries. Now, what level of value addition, the kind of agriculture transformation that is necessary, and the different kind of jobs that would create, as opposed to how our various surveys classify incomes from agricultural industries compared to other industries becomes a question. So if they're mainly looking at wage labor in very basic forms of agricultural industries versus much higher levels of value addition, it would both be a different outcome in terms of the incomes as well as the skill set used for agriculture industries. And finally, the kind of point I would want to make is that more equitable development of the country. And in a context of continuing crisis within Sri Lanka, the kind of global changes that we are seeing with more or less world trade, Trump regime's tariffs, that we would also need to rethink the whole question of what we mean by the tradable sector and the export orientation that has been claimed to be the solution, and maybe also start to think in terms of fully developing our own market through an idea, for example, of self-sufficiency and in industrial growth and even formal sectors to serve our internal market. For example, for the fact that we import 60% of our milk during the 2010s, we were importing something like $200 million worth of seafood into Sri Lanka. And I mentioned these clearly in relation to the point about the importance of agricultural industries and self-sufficiency, starting with our food system, given also the kind of crisis we are facing and the situation in the regions in terms of the food situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahilan. Before I also come in with a few comments, largely stimulated by Thiruni's and Ahilan's observations, let me just open up the floor to check if there are questions ready from the audience. Actually, is there any way by which, okay, let's begin with Vasi. She's sort of and Vasi Rajadure. Kindly introduce yourself very, very briefly and pose the question.
Okay,
Vasi,
my name is Vasi Rajadure. I'm talking from Sydney. I'm an accountant by background, but I've also I've been elected councillor in Sydney. I've been in the political framework, and all these three people who have spoken, we need to think about how fast we can bring the provincial council into Sri Lanka, how it will change the framework. Very critical, but I won't take any more time. Maybe I should be given another opportunity to talk. But also, Umesh, you must also know that till 2009, there was severe war happening in the north and east. And when you talk about GDP, when you break that flow of income, Western province, I think 60 or maybe 70, 80% would have come from commercially driven enterprises. Whereas when you look at the north and east, there's no fishing, no farming. So it was predominantly on armed forces, nurse, medical, and also maybe the teachers. So with that, I will stop. I think I've let other people to talk. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rajadure. Any other questions? Amala De Silva, over to you, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Umesh, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Just one comment as to whether it would be interesting to look at these issues from the human development sectors, because one of the reasons why I think a lot of focus falls on the Western province is the education sector. And the disparities in health, education are both issues that I think are very relevant and would be an interesting addition to your paper, because it's very interesting, the labor force issues. But alongside that, if you could look at whether there are big disparities in the human development sectors, I think that would be very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amar. Any of the other members of the audience wants to pose a question? We can always come back. Let me just add a few comments while the audience makes up her mind, his mind about questions. One is that both in a sense both sort of Thiruni and Ahilan raised an important question about industrial policy. It's one is to look at the disparity in public investment, but simply it's also, I mean, I think that there was a question about garments park. I think Thierry raised it about the garments, parks which were relatively better distributed, and despite that, why is it that the garments industry tended to cluster around Colombo? I mean, that actually raises a couple of important theoretical issues. One leads us into institutional economics, and I think that Umesh, you might do well to actually study how enterprises make their decisions in terms of the geographical location of their economic activity as a response to policy. We as economists tend to study policies and wonder, and the policies are thrown into a black box, and at the other end are outcomes in terms of economic responses. We forget that in the black box there are a number of institutions and individuals who are responding to those policies by investing, by taking production decisions. And at some stage, you would be doing a tremendous service to economic theorizing in Sri Lanka if you're able to explore better why do entrepreneurs take decisions on the basis of locational decisions of investment in production on the basis of policy stimuli. So that was something that showed up in their discussion. In fact, that's part of both the structural transformation issue that Thiruni raised and the relevance of industrial policy, including the sub issue of import substitution and the question of whether an export focus alone is something that's enough to raise both to transform in fact the nature of growth in Sri Lanka. Are there any other questions from the audience? Okay, in that case, let me just add a couple of points before we invite Umesh to respond. One the important issue that Umesh you raised and was also repeated by Ahilan is that if you analyze the extent of infrastructural investments, that is less regionally skewed than is evident in the labor market. And that's a very important political economic question, that it's quite possible that state investment in roads and power and whatever you may have has happened, but economic activity is not followed in terms of a spatial distribution, and that might be partly because, and then here I'm just speculating, partly because decision making regarding investment in infrastructure might have been taken, say, for purposes or other than economic, which is there might have been an incentive in terms of military activity, there might have been incentive in terms of something that purely supports certain forms of governance, rather than something that responds to the objective of distributing spatial economic activity. So, Umesh, you have a very interesting point, because a lot of geographical inequality might arise from infrastructural investment, and you don't find that. So that's again another issue that you might want to examine a little bit more in terms of the stimulus into the geographical spatial distribution of infrastructure investment. There is a question from the audience, Nilanta Atapattu. What policies or investments could be introduced to encourage industries and service sector businesses to establish operations outside the Western province. So it's again, the focus here is on policies, perhaps, and in fact that brings us to the question of a choice between horizontal policies, policies that are hesitant to differentiate across sectors and natures of enterprises that they seek to support, and vertical policies of the kind which is mentioned by both discussants, which are far more specific, which are like scalpels, which tend to deliver on fairly fine, precise objectives. So this is something that you may want to reflect upon. Okay, let me turn it over to you, Umesh, for your responses.
Thank you. Thank you, Srini. Thank you, Dr. Thiruni, Dr. Ahilan, Professor Amala, and everyone else who commented. So I'll have a few responses. Firstly, I think Dr. Thiruni made a very important point about the paper lacking some political economy dynamics. I acknowledge that it is a weakness, and the reason has been that this paper, I just want to put it as one of the base ideas to build upon. In fact, when I started this fellowship, I put myself in an uncharted territory of exploring the economic geography of a middle income transition, because I had explored the middle income transition from a very fiscal and balance of payment side. That is how my major research area. But when I was looking at this, I also realized that there is this other side of the story that has actually not been explored at all. So I wanted to explore that, and then I take this as a start of it. I think this could be more accompanied with a lot of political economy of it, in terms of why some of these decisions are made. To what Srini also said, that the infrastructure development is not spatially skewed as much as the employment or the labor market dynamics are. Infrastructure development did actually pick up in other areas. This is a constant comment that I got from Srini and other reviewers when I was doing the paper. So I've accommodated to the degree that I could. I also acknowledge what Professor Amala mentioned about human development. In this paper, I couldn't dig deep into the human development side due to the time limitations. I started looking at the educational differences, which I saw was fairly large actually across provinces, but at the same time, across the time period of low income to a middle income transition, the physical infrastructure, particularly in terms of the education and in health in particular, has actually gotten better. So that is certainly an area that I should be looking into, and then that requires a lot more time and a lot more in-depth and a lot more research into it. Other comment I really want to respond is what Dr. Thiruni mentioned about these development programs such as REAP and garment factory program, what we can learn from them. Again, due to the time limitations, I could not delve deep into it, but there was very limited research available about these development initiatives, whether it is a regional economic acceleration program or the garment factory programs. Garment factory program did have quite a few positives. Actually, for example, the program had 200 garment factories to be set up in 200 underdeveloped divisional secretariats. And under that program, there was one condition that each garment factory has to recruit a particular number of employees from a family in each Brahmanidari division that is getting Janasavi at the time. That is the welfare version of Asra Suma during President Premadasa's tenure. So there were good ones, but it requires both these programs require extensive research, which I believe is actually important. Extensive archival research and also qualitative research to dig to conduct interviews and trace back what exactly happened with these programs, which is very much lacking. I think this is also largely to the research is sometimes now largely focused on what is available, and going back is not an easy task to do, but I think that is very much required, because that will only give the answers. That is why I don't have specific answers to some of these questions that are raised, because it requires much more in-depth work in terms of understanding why some of these programs succeed, why some of these programs fail, and what aspects of those programs succeeded. What I had given is a very basic account, I acknowledge that. And this requires a lot more work in terms of lot more qualitative work, and it will also take a lot of time, because it's a research area that requires going, lot of going back to the past and seeing where some of these programs have failed. And in some certain cases, what Srini said in the beginning, in some cases data is not available. In some cases, the archival materials are not available. I was surprised to find out that some of the annual labor force reports were not there even in the Department of Census and Statistics when I started doing this research. The same goes to the program like LEAP and the garment factory program. But that doesn't mean that we should stop as researchers. So I think that is certainly that point is taken, and that is, I think, is a very important research area to look at, and why those what aspects of those succeeded and what aspects of those failed. Overall, on what also Dr. Ahilan mentioned, is I didn't really touch too much on North and East for a couple of reasons. One, Ahilan and I think Dr. Sarunathan had done quite an extensive work already on the northern and eastern parts of the country. And to be frank, my understanding is limited, and then those two provinces are significantly affected by the conflict for a very long period of time. So it's not fair for me to parachuting my opinions on a region that I have very limited understanding on, that is really affected by the conflict, that requires a lot more work delving into that and how it come about. Finally, in terms of industrial policies and the political economy, I think one of the important things that I'm looking to do is in terms of improving this paper. I'll put this B as the improved version as a first draft or a working paper. But based on these comments, what I want to do is bringing in more theoretical and political economy aspects to integrate into it, particularly to explain why the labor market or the GDP is spatially skewed, although the infrastructure development seems less spatially skewed, as pointed out by Srini, and then probably looking to various aspects as different parts of the papers, because to be frank, it's also very difficult to incorporate all of these different dynamics into one paper. I remember one of the major comments I got from Dr. Thiruni for the first draft was that this requires consistent signposting, because I'm jumping from one topic to another, and it's a very broad area, right? So it requires quite a lot of work in terms of amalgamating these and probably fragmenting into clear sections or different papers, each of which could delve into each of that issue. So I thank very much for the comments of everyone. And I think, let me also respond to the comments, a couple of comments in the chat. For the first one, what policies or investment could be introduced, I think Ahilan partly establish some nuances to this question, whether we can be rely on tourism or not. One is, there's a labor demand issue here in terms of expanding businesses outside the Western province. One is incentivizing businesses to go into these peripheral provinces in terms of peripheral provinces through different government incentives. That could be some tax breaks.
Umesh, you need to wrap up in just a minute.
Yes, yeah. So overall, I think there is some sort of state intervention is required. My point is to both those questions is state intervention is required to disperse the growth into the peripheral provinces. What form of state intervention that it is, I don't know yet. But it also shouldn't be very inefficient or largely political driven. It is something up for the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Umesh. I will just build on Susai's. It's a very important issue that he's bringing up, which is part of the inequality is also because certain spatially concentrated industries are going through a very difficult time, and that includes plantation as probably the most extreme example. And you could look at coastal fisheries. In fact, you could also look at agriculture. I even draw attention to how Sri Lanka is now not self-sufficient anymore. So it's not merely looking at industrial policy as a set of instruments to support exporting industries, but also to support, in fact, and new industries, but also to support some of the more traditional sources of employment, which if they decline will also lead to secondary deterioration in economic conditions and everything else that society has rightly listed. And the other point, Umesh, that you might want to think about is what was raised by another contributor, which is how does economic decision making get distributed between the government in Colombo and provincial governments and further down? And that too might hold, I mean, China is a wonderful example, that too also might hold some clues as to why infrastructure does not convert into economic opportunities. And finally, I do want to repeat this. In fact, a lot of people who are critical of Joe Biden's industrial policy in the US draw attention to the fact that there's an insufficient understanding of what motivates investors and entrepreneurs to invest in business. And I think that the set of policies that you're talking about, the need for policies to support economic activity, also needs to be based on refining knowledge on what moves entrepreneurs. Only then would we have a little more, a little better distribution and less skewness in economic activity. And that's, I mean, because economic inequality is also partly contributing and in turn contributed by the other issues that we've seen in terms of regional strife, and which all of you have been working on. And Umesh has done very, very rightly in drawing attention to the geographical inequality in Sri Lanka. We need to close now, and after a 4-minute break, we start on the next session. So while Vasi is sort of typing out, and I'd encourage him to do that, some points which Umesh can take note of. Let's close here. And we'll join up in precisely 4 minutes from now. Thank you very much, Umesh. Thank you very much, Dr. Thiruni and Dr. Ahilan, and thanks to all participants for this lively session.